I also want to welcome my mom here, who doesn't get to hear me talk that often, Eugenia Summers. So there you go. I'm going to talk today about the case for abolition. It's going to be more of a sort of an argument style of talk, where I'm going to list 6 reasons that I think the sale of cigarettes should be abolished. And I use the word abolished deliberately. I want to make the case for abolition, not prohibition. In other words, if you think about it, the opposite of prohibition is freedom, but the opposite of abolition is slavery. And that's one of the themes I want to stress, in a sense, the importance of the meanings of words, which the tobacco industry understands better than anyone, but also the sense of enslavement that's involved in tobacco. So I want to give you 6 reasons for abolishing cigarettes. And the first one is that there's 6 trillion cigarettes smoked every year. And by the way, that's 500 kilometers of cigarettes strung to end, which is enough to circle the globe 13,000 times, or to stretch from the sun to the earth and back, with enough left over for a few side trips to Mars. And by the way, that's when Mars is in a near-Earth orbit, so full disclosure on that. And by the way, that's these cigarettes since cigarettes cause about 1 death for every million smoked, wherever you are in the world. It's actually a beautifully simple statistic that I developed in the 1990s, which is a very useful handle. It allows you to predict, and I was able to predict on the basis of this, that 100 million people died in the 20th century from smoking, and predicted for the first time that 1 billion people would die in this century. But actually, even if we go down to 0 now, we're still going to have 300 or 400 million deaths from cigarettes. So cigarettes are produced at a rate faster than satellites orbit the Earth, about 50 times the speed of sound, or about 15 kilometers of cigarettes being smoked every second. Okay, so that's very important to get the total magnitude. So this is the first reason that cigarettes are deadly. And if you actually compare it with all kinds of other war deaths, tobacco deaths dwarf all sources of others, and this is why. This is, on the right-hand column, is the actual amount of toxins that are actually inhaled. So you can go down and just look at these, just the amount of ammonia, 510,000 kilograms of ammonia, or choose your poison here. Hydrogen cyanide, 2 million kilograms of hydrogen cyanide inhaled every year. So this is why there's all this tobacco death. And just to put this in perspective, the 60 million kilograms of tar that are inhaled every year by smokers is enough to fill 6,000 railroad cars all the way to the very top, full of tar, all going directly into the lungs of smokers. So it's about 100 of these trains. This train is 60 cars here, so imagine 100 of these train cars completely full with tar going every year into the lungs of smokers. And by the way, about 1/10 that amount, so that would be 600 railroad cars, goes into the lungs of non-smokers, and about 60 of those railroad cars would go into just from re-radiation from so-called third-hand smoke. And the cigarette factories, one of the problems is people tend to think of tobacco as a solved problem or non-existent. The tobacco industry has been very successful in making themselves invisible. So I'd like to have a raise of hands here who knows the 3 companies that make all of the world's cigarette cigarette making machines. Yeah, there are only 3 companies that make all the world's cigarette machines. I've never been to a talk where I've asked people and they know the answer. There are 3 companies. It's Hauni, GD in Bologna, Hauni in Hamburg, GD in Moulins in London. And no one knows about these. The tobacco control community talks a lot about cessation. They only talk about cessation of consumption. They never talk about cessation of production. It's as if we were all researching malaria and no one ever looks at the mosquito or the swamp. It's unbelievable. The tobacco industry has made itself invisible. And as a result, there are these factories that produce death at a higher rate than any other factories in history. Philip Morris Richmond producing 146,000 deaths per year, and so forth. And so these are the machines that produce these cigarettes at such enormous rates, and they produce it at an extremely fast rate. Now, in the 19th century, when the cigarette girls and women, and they were all girls and women, rolled cigarettes, they could only roll between 200 and 1,000 per day. The bond set, and so this is just a tip. This one actually happens to be a cigar factory, but there would be these enormous factories where women would roll these cigarettes. And what happens in the 1880s is the bond sack machine is invented, and this allowed the mechanized production of cigarettes and dropped the price by a factor of 10. So the affordability increased by tenfold. And it basically created an enormous excess supply of cigarettes. And the industry responded by producing mass marketing in order to dispose of this huge excess supply. So there are only 2.5 billion cigarettes smoked in 1900. And this grows and grows and grows. And usually I do a quiz, but I won't do a quiz for you on this. But most people don't know that the peak year for production in the United States, Joanna, what would you guess? What's the peak year for production? Don't tell her the answer.
I would say in the 60s.
Okay, that's what everyone says. It's 1997. 1997, it peaks at 770 billion cigarettes produced in American factories. Again, the factories are invisible. The industry wants to make itself invisible. It's as if cigarettes arrive at the gas station. That's where they're born. No one traces it back to the swamp or the mosquito. And these, if you were actually to use these, if you were actually to make the cigarettes produced today in the United States using the same technology of the 19th century, it would require a labor force of 3 million people. 3 million people would be required to make the cigarettes produced in the United States every year, which is only 350 billion. So it's down by about half from the peak year of consumption. Anyway, this bond sack machine was just the beginning, and if you look at the industry's secret documents, you can find they're fascinated with the increasing production, and they've basically got a Moore's law of cigarette manufacturing. I mean, it basically doubles every decade or so, and so the recent machines are now over 20,000 per minute. And this is much faster than the eye can see. So they're produced at an extremely high rate. And that's why we have the increasing consumption. And this is consumption, not production. Part of the trick of that production question that I asked Joanne is that a third of those are being exported. But the peak of production is 1982 or so, around 630 billion cigarettes because of this mass mechanization. And by the way, this mechanization was the first really significant continuous process manufacturing. Cigarettes are made as an infinite rope, and then they're sliced up. And this is why they're able to make them so fast. Again, a fast machine will shoot out at over 60 miles per hour. One machine will shoot out cigarettes continuously. It's like a spinning thing. It's really fast. Anyway, this is why we have so much lung cancer death, this mass production. And here's the sort of per capita result. And there's a micro history to the production, to the, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but there's a history to the ebb and flow of the per capita consumption. And I figured that there's one lung cancer for every 3 million cigarettes, and this based on some work that Dahl had done earlier, just tracking out the sort of dose response curve across time compared with the 20-year time lag. Okay, so the first reason is that cigarettes are deadly, and the second reason they should be abolished is that the cigarette is a defective product. And this is something that's very important. Cigarettes are not inherently dangerous. They're dangerous by design. That's a very important point. I think even the FDA law says cigarettes are inherently dangerous. That's some clever writing there. They're not inherently dangerous. They're dangerous by design, and what that means is they're more like a car with faulty brakes rather than a car. And every car is dangerous, but a car with faulty brakes is a defective car because it could be less dangerous, and they kill more than necessary, and they are addictive by design, and there are actually two easy solutions to this. You can make them kill much fewer people by simply raising the pH of the tobacco smoke back up to where it was in the 19th century when cigarettes and all tobacco, in fact, was not inhalable. It was too strong, too harsh. The entire history of tobacco manufacturing has been to make cigarettes ever milder, and that means more inhalable. And they use all kinds of tricky chemicals, menthols and theobromine and cocoa and levulinic acid. All kinds of things are added to make it ever easier to inhale. And that's why so many people die from lung cancer. You could remember, people don't die from lung cancer from smoking cigars. And by that I mean the way cigars used to be, not little cigars today, because little cigars today are just big brown cigarettes. What's happening is the industry is they're seeing the end of cigarettes, and so they're turning cigars into big brown cigarettes. But in any event, if you made all tobacco products be not inhalable, in other words, freebase them up to the point where the smoke pH is above 8, you would eliminate the entire lung cancer epidemic worldwide and basically all bronchitis and emphysema. The other thing you do is remove the nicotine, and the FDA is probably going to do this before too long. I hope they do it. In any event, you can make cigarettes not addictive by simply removing the nicotine, and that's pretty easily, and it's allowable by law as long as you don't reduce it to zero. Okay, flu curing, that's the key defect. This is a technology prior to the late 19th century. All tobacco was cured by just drying it in sheds. And the native tobacco leaf, when you pick it, has about 25% by-weight sugar in the form of polysaccharides and other sugars. And when you dry it, the way the Native Americans did, this goes down to 2% sugar. The reason that's important, sugar is probably the most important chemical besides nicotine in cigarettes. Because when you burn sugar, it produces organic acids. And if you can trap the sugar in the leaf, it neutralizes the nicotine alkaloid and drops the pH down to 6.5 and makes it very inhalable. So the modern inhalable cigarette, which is all cigarettes today, is made by using flue-cured tobacco, which is very high in sugar. What happens if you flue-cure tobacco? What that means is you put it in a barn with flues, which are tubes or conduits, and you run heat through those conduits. And when you're drying the tobacco leaf, you heat it up to a pretty high temperature, and that stops the enzymatic processes that digest the sugars and reduce, drop them way down. So if you stop that process, you trap the sugar, you get a very sugary leaf. The sugar, again, when it burns, converts into organic acids. It neutralizes the nicotine alkaloid, and it becomes inhalable. This was actually a method invented by accident by a slave in the 1830s who was sort of guarding the fires in a barn, and the fire went out, and he rushed out and couldn't find any wood, so he threw charcoal on the fire, and it burned much hotter and produced, for the first time, this flue-cured golden yellow tobacco leaf like this. It's a very colory, bright yellow leaf, which is very sugary. Again, sugar is the key because it produces a mild chemistry of tobacco. And this was viewed as a safer smoke and a milder smoke, and that was thought to be a safer cigarette. The tragic irony is that in the quest to make smoke ever milder, they actually made it much more deadly. And this sort of fits historically, because if you think about it, the main theory of cancer causation prior to the mutation theory of Watson and Crick was irritation. The idea was that irritation caused cancer. That's the dominant theory of carcinogenesis in the first half of the 20th century. So they thought by making it ever milder, it would be less deadly. And the industry knew it was causing cancer because already in 1915, the American Tobacco Company offered $20,000 to the National Research Council to do a project on tobacco and cancer. 1915. And the NRC turned this project down. But it does show that there's a lot of cancer concern way before they think there is. Okay, it's addictive by design because the pH of tobacco smoke is manipulated. It's made to be inhalable. There are a lot of things that are added. For example, licorice. Most people don't know that 90% of the world's licorice goes into cigarettes. This is such a massive industry. The nicotine is, of course, naturally in tobacco, but it's manipulated to a precise amount. So every brand has a 2 decimal point content. The deliveries are meaningless. This took me a long time to realize, but all delivery figures are meaningless because of compensation and self-titration. The only really important fact is how much nicotine is in the cigarette, and they're all about 2%, no matter what type of cigarette that it is. And what you need to do is take this down by 97%, and if you were to do this, you'd actually have a cigarette that could not create or sustain addiction. And instead of this, tens of billions of dollars, according to the industry, have been spent making a perfect addiction engine. Okay, so it's deadly, it's defective. The third reason to get rid of cigarettes, and by the way, when I say abolition, I mean a ban on the sale of cigarettes, not on consumption, not on use. In other words, people should be free to grow whatever they want, to smoke whatever they want. If they want to go into their basement and smoke lead paint chips or whatever, they should be free to. And, I grow tobacco in my front yard, and if I want to go smoke it in the basement, that's fine. should be allowed to do that. But the sale of it is simply too dangerous and defective to be legal. So I would distinguish that this eliminates the enforcement problem and some other problems. Anyway, the third reason to abolish is that they're a huge financial burden, enormous health care costs, $200 billion per year, lost productivity, the world's major cause of fires, including fire deaths, about 800 fire deaths. It's like a drop in the bucket, but it's 800 real people. Wasted resources, environmental costs, including denialism. I'll say a little bit more about that. But big tobacco is also, this is reason number 4 to get rid of cigarettes, and that's that big tobacco is a corrupting force in human civilization. I've put the health minister of the Netherlands there, who's known colloquially over there as the tobacco minister because of her close ties to the tobacco industry. But the corruption is a very important point to think about in tobacco. The tobacco is the most important source of corruption in modern society, in my view, and I think there are many different ways this is expressed. Of course, it's the most important source of corrupting the lungs and the heart. My wife used to have to bandage the feet of her uncle, the oozing sores of her uncle's feet that the pus would run out and eventually had to be amputated. And just a couple of years ago, I said, well, was he a smoker? And she said, well, yes, what does that have to do with it? And she didn't even know that one of the leading causes of amputation is smoking, because you get these sores and you get vasoconstriction of the extremities. It's why you can often tell a smoker by a handshake or even the color of their face. But it's also true that people don't know this, and in Brazil they say it's too bad you can't use the smell of Berger's disease, the sores, because it's more profound even than the image of these rotting feet. But in any event, so it's a source of corruption in many ways, corruption of media, public media, and film. I'll show some slides on that in a second. It's a major force. In fact, I think it's the most important source of corruption of science, tobacco industry is, since the Nazi period. I'm doing a project now on the 25 Nobel laureates who've worked for the tobacco industry. The discoverer of prions, for example, got $4 million to do all of his prion research for the industry. There's a long history of Nobel laureates working for the industry. In other words, this goes to the highest levels of society. And by corruption, I simply mean impairing the proper functioning of. That's all I mean by that, is that science is not what it should be. It's been corrupted by the industry. It's corrupted the medical profession. The American medical profession did not endorse the 1964 Surgeon General's report because they'd been basically paid off. The tobacco industry in 1963 gave the AMA $10 million as hush money, basically a deal where the AMA would not say anything bad about tobacco, and in turn, big tobacco helped try to defeat Medicare and Medicaid and socialized medicine. So for 10 years, over 10 years actually, the AMA was relatively silent on tobacco, and they would not endorse the 1964 Surgeon General's report. But the same thing was true with the presidency. The young Joseph Califano was Assistant Secretary of Health under Johnson, and Califano tried to get President Johnson to endorse the 1964 Surgeon General's report. And Johnson said, look, we've just lost the South on civil rights. If we go against tobacco, we'll lose the presidency to the Republicans. That's how big tobacco was. It was bigger than civil rights. And this, despite the fact that Johnson was perfectly willing to endorse the reality of global warming. He has an elaborate thing saying that the planet is warming, carbon dioxide is the cause, this is a big concern. This is 1965. And so while he's endorsing global warming, he won't say that smoking causes cancer. And in fact, no president mentioned the cancer-tobacco link until Jimmy Carter in 1977, even though the National Cancer Act of the 1930s required that the president issue an annual statement on cancer every year. And so in 1940, 41, 42, 43, all the way up to 1977, no president mentioned tobacco or cigarettes in their annual statement on cancer until Jimmy Carter. And then after that, even some presidents did. Every president of the 20th century smoked, right up, and as up to the present century as well. The tobacco industry had direct access to the White House. In fact, if you went on the roof of the Tobacco Institute, which is not that far from here, or used to be not that far from here, you could throw a rock if you had a really good arm and hit the White House. I mean, it was right at the corridors of power. And they had tremendous, a corrupting influence. They corrupted senators. 10 senators appeared in tobacco ads. United States senators, this is mainly in the 30s and 40s when they were using all kinds of people. Corrupted law, the Section 402 of American Litigation Doctrine written by the the American Law Institute exempts tobacco. Basically, the law of the text that said, you can't sue for strawberries just because someone is allergic to strawberries, because strawberries are a wholesome product. The same thing with tobacco. Wholesome tobacco you can't sue for, but maybe you could sue for tobacco if it was contaminated with something like marijuana or opium. That was written by the Tobacco Institute and embraced now in American litigation doctrine. And also anti-environmental propaganda, setting the model for and funding denialism. The tobacco industry has been historically one of the major sources of environmental denialism with respect to global warming. So there's an alliance unified around free market fundamentalism where the tobacco industry funds many of these right-wing think tanks whose business is to say that basically either cigarettes don't cause cancer or more recently global warming is a hoax. And this in the long run may be the deadliest influence of the tobacco industry on human civilization is by prolonging effective action on global warming. And that could actually end up killing more people than actual tobacco. So that's something to put in your pipe and smoke. Okay, so then we have 1953 as the moment of conspiracy, the launching of the denialist campaign. It's important to realize that this conspiracy has names and a date, December 14th, 1953. The tobacco industry met, the heads of all the families met in the Plaza Hotel and orchestrated a conspiracy to deny the hazards of smoking. And most of it is still ongoing in the present. And this I'll come to in a moment. But we also have this moment of 1953 and 54, 55, where you have the masculinization of Marlboro. Marlboro used to be a women's cigarette. And with the proof that it was causing deadly harm on a massive scale, they shifted over to the Marlboro Cowboy. And not only that, Marlboro becomes a masculine cigarette with the Cowboy, but also it's introduced in a hard pack. And I think that semiotically, the hard pack is basically to resist cancer. So there's a lot of interesting symbolic work that goes on. The industry publishes the frank statement. This is probably the most expensive advertisement in history up to that time, saying that there's no proof that it's causing cancer. You start to get many different forms of product reassurance. This one is menthol. The sale of menthol cigarettes skyrockets right at this moment of conspiracy when the really good animal experimental evidence is coming in, the epidemiology is coming in, the pathology and the chemical analytics showing the presence of known carcinogens in cigarette smoke. Right at that moment, you get the hard pack. Marlboro shifts sex. You have the spike of menthol. Look at the spike of menthol right at this period of conspiracy. The same is true with the sale of filter cigarettes. The same a little bit later with king sizes, which were also a form of reassurance design. So there's all types of events that are happening right at this moment of conspiracy that are very important. And this is the philosophy that's developed by the industry. This is from an internal famous memo of Brown and Williamson in 1969, that doubt is our product. We really are an industry producing two things. We're producing the fact of tobacco and the reality, and we're producing ignorance in the population insofar as we can. And they actually mathematize this. They would show propaganda films, and they would show you a film, and they'd say, one of the many propaganda films, they would ask you beforehand, do you believe the Surgeon General is right when he says cigarette smoking causes cancer? And they would measure X percent. Then they would show you the propaganda film, and they showed that they could increase ignorance by 17.8% just by showing this film. So they actually quantified it. And some radical Harvard students actually got wind of some of the money that the industry was pumping into tobacco industry in 1973, cautioning that Harvard may be hazardous to your health. Every university, every major university, was captured by the industry to a certain extent. No one has done a study of Hopkins, but I'm sure there are dozens of professors at Hopkins who took big-time tobacco money. It'd be a very easy project to do it. You could write it in 1 month and publish it. It'd make a lot of attention Hopkins, caution, Hopkins may be hazardous to your health. And you could do this for every university. It actually would be important to do. This is just one project I did. I opened my bulletin, The History of Medicine. My thing's not really working here. But in any event, there are 4 or 5 people working secretly for the industry. None of these people are disclosed. This is a guy who organized a lot of expertise for the industry. This guy was he was a project director of Cosmic Project, Philip Morris's Cosmic Project. This was another project director of Project Cosmic for Philip Morris. This is all secret stuff, not disclosed at all. And the words here, the controversy, this is all industry language. And this guy worked as an expert witness for the industry. This is the Project Cosmic director. This was an expert witness for the industry. This guy was paid. He was offered to be paid by the industry, and he called me. He said they offered to pay him, and they said, "What's your fee?" And he said, "Well, maybe I could charge $125 an hour." And they said, No. To a jury, that will sound like too much. Why don't you say $75 an hour, but we'll pay you 24 hours a day. So they were going to pay him while he slept, which seemed like a kind of a good deal. Okay, I'd mentioned the corruption of film. Sylvester Stallone was offered $500,000 to smoke, and Brown and Williams and Brandon 5 of his films. There's been a huge upsurge recently in smoking in films. All of the leading films from last year, it seems, had a lot of smoking. Argo and Zero Dark 30. They're even capturing the sound, which is new, this little sizzle sound of the smoke they've managed to capture now. It's very interesting, and the haptics of it are very interesting. I recommend to you watching the newly released Mike Wallace interviews from the 1950s, where he interviews Ayn Rand and the head of the Ku Klux Klan, but also Margaret Sanger. And there's a wonderful interview with Margaret Sanger. It's an hour-long program. And Philip Morris is the sponsor, and Mike Wallace is just holding it right like this, and it's sort of this central feature, this smoking cigarette. And he goes on and on about Philip Morris. And at the end of this interview, which has nothing to do with tobacco, it's just the sponsor, Margaret Sanger says, I've never been a smoker. Margaret Sanger's 80 years old at this point, the great pioneer of birth control for women. She says, I've never been a smoker, Mike, but I think I'm going to start smoking and smoke Philip Morris cigarettes. They just sound really great, and it's unbelievable to watch. So you can just watch that online. It's a lot of fun. The tobacco industry has also been very successful in corrupting symbols. Smoking is a form of free speech. Here we have basically the old Jewish quarter of Amsterdam marked off as the smoking section. And the tobacco industry, Philip Morris is here saying basically that smokers today are being treated like the Jews under the Nazis. And that that smokers are being forced to sit at the back of the bus. This is something they say over and over again. Smokers are being lynched. Smokers are second-class citizens. There's a whole sort of rhetoric of civil rights that's being applied to this. And basically what they've managed to do is capture the high ground of freedom, leaving longevity to tobacco's critics. And that's what needs to be inverted, because really, cigarettes are not a form of freedom. They do not create freedom. How free is someone who's dying of emphysema? So it's unbelievably clever that they've managed to capture the rhetoric of freedom. Okay, they've also been involved in corrupting humor. There have been various plans to actually create humor and to give it what they call the light touch tobacco, and this was deliberate also from the 1950s and 60s on, and there are lots of things like this. I'm doing a project now on the history of tobacco industry humor, in other words, to see what jokes they tell the public, but also what jokes they tell themselves, because it's very important to understand what their own psychology is, what is funny to a tobacco person. You can track this because there are over 100 industry newsletters that are available online in the secret documents. Also corrupting children's behavior. People above a certain age will remember candy cigarettes. This is Harvard brand candy cigarettes that were supposed to be just like, if you were smoking them, you could be just like Daddy. And we know that the tobacco industry actually quietly approved of this. And in one secret memo from the late 1940s, they said it was not too bad an advertisement for their products. It's basically creating training and gestures for the future smoker. Corruptions of the body of animals. a lot of experiments. Philip Morris and the other companies have funded the Southwest Research Institute with the world's largest baboonery, where they've addicted baboons to cigarettes and crack cocaine and various other things like that. So there's a long history of that as well. So the fifth reason to get rid of cigarettes is that they harm the environment. And this possibly will become the main reason that cigarettes are banned, the sale of cigarettes. I think when we start trying to reduce the global footprint to the carbon footprint to far below what it is now and really start going carbon negative, we're going to have to start getting rid of certain forms of excess consumption. And an obvious one is going to be cigarettes. So I think this is actually the main reason that cigarettes will actually be banned. And that's that they are enormous users of resources. They're involved in deforestation. 20 Manhattans per year are deforested just to make the charcoal for flue curing. In China, coal is one of the main sources of fuel for flue curing. It's a massive user of this. And just in the United States, you could have a huge impact on global warming if you would get rid of cigarettes. There's a standard method called the Economic Input-Output Life Cycle Assessment, which measures the global footprint of an industry and in terms of global warming. And the $47 billion tobacco industry in the U.S. generates 16 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents, and that's just to the factory gate. Ignores transport, retail, customer pickup, advertising, legal carbon footprint. So every time I fly to a trial, there's a huge carbon footprint. I wouldn't be here. Maybe I'd be talking about something else. But so if you think about just the energy that goes into that, that's part of it as well. So just into the minimal estimate, it would be the equivalent of taking over 4 million cars off the road, and that doesn't even count the medical carbon footprint. Treatment of diseases from tobacco has a huge carbon footprint as well. Finally, and I think from an ethical point of view, this is the main, in other words, the last one is the most important practical reason cigarettes will be banned. This one, I think, is the most important ethical reason, is that smoking is not a recreational drug. Smoking of cigarettes in particular. An argument could be made that smoking of cigars, expensive cigars, or cigars that are not inhalable is a recreational drug. They're not used compulsively. Their pattern of purchase is highly episodic, unlike cigarettes, which are every day, 20 per day. So unlike alcohol and unlike marijuana, both of which are recreational drugs, arguably, smoking is not like drinking. It's not like marijuana. The smoking of cigarettes is like being an alcoholic, and we know this also just from the internal documents of the tobacco industry, the newly released Canadian documents. Robert Beckson says, like alcoholics, smokers realize that they will always be smokers and can always fall off the wagon. And the comparison is made that smoking is not like drinking. It's like being an alcoholic. And that's very different. So whereas only 5% of people who drink alcohol are addicted, in other words, are alcoholics, 90% of people who smoke daily are addicted. So there's a fundamental different libertarian calculus. And smokers, when we do regret studies, eventually smokers mostly come to regret, about 90% eventually come to regret having ever smoked. That's not true for drinking. It's not true for marijuana use. So it's not a recreational drug. And non-smokers, how many smokers of cigarettes are in the audience here? It's not one single one, and no one's afraid to admit it. Non-smokers tend not to understand this fact about smoking, that smokers dislike the fact. In fact, I learned this from what I call the taxi driver test. I would always ask taxi drivers, why do you smoke, and what do you think might happen? And the two things I learned from it was the most common view about what will happen if you smoke, is that it's in God's hands. I mean, I've never seen tobacco control people talking about this, but that's the dominant view about cancer causation, is that it's in God's hands. It's not in our hands. It's not in the cigarette's hands. If God wants it or if Allah wants it, that will determine it. But the other thing is they would say, don't tax it. I'll pay whatever you ask. Don't tax it. Ban it. And I kept hearing this over and over and over again. The two main groups that are thinking seriously about banning the sale of cigarettes are the tobacco industry, which has been wondering why in the world it hasn't been banned ever since 1953. They're amazed. It's like, wow, this is, it's like gravy train. And the other group is smokers. they've been thinking about banning it for a long time. It's the tobacco control people. The first time I went to a tobacco control meeting, I felt like I was in the tobacco industry in some sense. It's like it's complicit because it's control. You don't control asbestos. You don't control the Anopheles mosquito. You get rid of the poison. So, okay, another way to think about this, the 1964 Surgeon General's report showed that cigarette smoking causes disease. The 1988 Surgeon General's report showed that cigarette smoking is a disease. And this is different. It's interestingly different. Okay, other myths. One is that tobacco is a solved problem, old news. Not tobacco again. It's very interesting. The myth is that the industry's come clean. Tobacco is so 1980s or so 1990s. That was all solved with the Master Settlement Agreement and all of that, and those lawsuits and all of that. No one really smokes anymore. Just look around. None of us smoke, so problem solved, right? None of us in the whole room smoke. Solved problem, old news. Why study this? The industry's come clean. They're responsible corporate citizens. They have whole departments of product integrity, whole departments of stewardship. They love corporate social responsibility. They love harm reduction, which is also being used for bridge products. In other words, what can we give someone so that they won't have to quit when they're flying a long trip? Another myth: the industry does not exist. The tobacco industry is never mentioned in any of the early Surgeon General's reports. And again, think about cessation. What fraction of the time when people say cessation do they mean production versus consumption? 99% or maybe 100% it's cessation of consumption. Put all the blame on the smoker. Don't put it on the industry. Put it on the smoker. The smoker's to blame. That's what the industry has many, many secret projects just to produce. It's as if cigarettes fall from the sky. We never go upstream. But the fact, has the industry come clean? Well, in fact, if you look at films like Food, Inc., which is a great film, they start off the film saying, we need to solve the problem of tobacco the way we solved tobacco. We really fixed that problem. That's a solved problem. In fact, no tobacco company in the world has ever admitted that it's marketed to kids. No tobacco company's ever admitted lying to the public. No tobacco company's ever admitted forming a conspiracy to hide the cigarette hazards. No tobacco company's ever admitted that millions of people have died from smoking. They won't admit that. They won't say any number. They'll say more than one, but they won't say more than 100, or 1,000 have ever died from smoking. They won't admit that filters, lotars, and lights are all completely fraudulent. And even the tobacco control people don't realize this mostly. I mean, there's some recognition of it, but how filters actually work, they're not filters at all. Cigarette filters are filters if you think that an hourglass filters sand. Cigarette filters are filters if you think that speed bumps stop traffic. Okay, they don't. You're able to, they're not filters in any sense of the word. It's a completely mythology. You can achieve the same thing by squeezing the tobacco tighter. You can squeeze it all the way tight and nothing will come out. So the efficiency of a filter is purely a measure of tightness of constriction. And filters don't do anything. They do not trap, because it's all poison. There's no selective, there's such a thing as clean water. That's why water filters are a reality. There's no such thing as clean smoke. American Tobacco Company, the biggest tobacco company in the world, realized this in the 1950s, and that's why they refused to make filters, except for Terryton, which is a minor brand. The companies that were willing to go to make the fraud, which was Reynolds with Winston, Philip Morris with Marlboro, they're the world's leaders now. American Tobacco went out of business. It was bought by Brown & Williamson in 1994. The biggest tobacco company in the world disappears because they were honest enough to refuse to go along with the filter fraud, at least for a time. So tobacco control people need to understand how a cigarette actually works in order to understand why it's meaningless to say that, oh yeah, at least we're making filters, Okay, no tobacco company has ever admitted that the cigarettes made today are as deadly as any ever made. You can go right around the drugstore, buy the world's deadliest cigarettes, or here's the one I just picked up in Amsterdam, Glam cigarettes. I wonder which market this is for. Glam, nice little pink pocket if you're a little, So who is this targeting? Glam cigarettes. No, these are as deadly as any. What's changed is that you get about twice the cancer per gram of cigarette. because these are only weigh half. The cigarette law of 1922 said had to have 1.3 grams of tobacco in every cigarette. Now these all weigh less than about 0.7, 0.6 grams. The lightest weigh 0.4 grams, a quarter what they weighed in the 20s. And yet they're causing about the same death per cigarette. And so cigarettes today, the most important fact about tobacco over the last 100 years is the industry's managed to extract more death per gram of cigarette, about twice as much. No tobacco company has ever admitted manipulating nicotine chemistry to create and sustain addiction. No tobacco company has ever admitted that cigarettes are as addictive as heroin or cocaine, and no tobacco company has ever admitted that nicotine addiction causes death. And that's kind of like a trick point, because they say it's addictive, but then everything's addictive. So sugar's addictive, jogging is addictive, so big deal. That's one thing. They trivialize it, and then they say it's true that smoking causes death, but they won't say how many, just maybe some. And then they won't make the connection that nicotine addiction causes death. Okay, so we need product standards. We need to drop the nicotine in rod below 0.4 milligrams per cigarettes, which is about what you need to make it subcompensable. We know this from the industry's internal documents, which have to be studied in order to make proper regulation. You have to do historical work to know the science. You should not allow any cigarette to be sold with pH under 8. Those two first things alone would do more for public health history than anything in human history. It would save more lives than any. It would dwarf, John Snow's taking the handle off the cholera off the pump on Broad Street. We need less important things like a polonium standard, nitrosamine standard, things like that. And we need a correction of the instruction defect. Cigarettes come with improper instructions. It's kind of an important, interesting, ignored point. But in searching for the obscure, do not overlook the obvious. A very famous doctor said this a while back. Like cholera, tobacco is an industrial point source disease, a toxic hazard. We live in a world of radical tobacco exceptionalism. If someone tried to introduce them today, they'd immediately be banned. The irony is that some things that are obviously less deadly get banned, like electronic cigarettes or other types of things. Europe bans all smokeless tobacco. It's not allowed. Here it's growing. A lot of money is being put into huge push for snus and orbs and sticks and dissolvables, things like that. We live in this world of radical tobacco exceptionalism because of the power of the industry. And what's also not known is how much power we have. If the city of Baltimore wanted to ban the sale of cigarettes, they could do it overnight. If the state of Maryland wanted to ban the sale of cigarettes, they could do it overnight. Not only that, but they have done it in the past. 15 states banned the sale of cigarettes from the 1890s to 1927. This was challenged in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, yes, you have the right. Every state has the right to ban the sale of cigarettes. Almost nobody knows that. Every local community, a town of 80 in Utah, could ban the sale of cigarettes. And this is one of the things that needs to be done. We need to think creatively about things like that. People are not thinking creatively. If there's one thing we're short of, I think it's imagination. Okay, so I think I'll quit there and open it up for discussion. Yes, okay.
Well, maybe I'll start. And I'll pull on the point that you mentioned at the end was the correction of the instructional deficit. So
Defect, yeah.
a defect with proper instruction. So, as of last week or the week before, we heard that this country still has to wait for more up-to-date health warnings on our cigarette packs, whereas same companies put these warnings on packs in other countries and inform users in other countries. Well, let me ask you a provocative question then. So why do you think we can abolish cigarettes when we can't even put a health warning on our
Because of the question is, how could we possibly abolish cigarettes if we can't even put a warning? The key question there is who we are. If we are a little town in Northern California that has already banned smoking downtown, has already banned smoking in conjoined housing, has already banned smoking on beaches, it's not such a big step to ban the sale of cigarettes in that local community. Not the use, but the sale. The key is who we are. If you think like a state, generally the tobacco industry will win. And that's what most people think of. They think of we are the state, but don't think like a state. Think like the way California and New York and other places have been so successful. They're thinking locally about local regulations, and that's where a lot of the power is, because the tobacco industry cannot manipulate all the local little environments. They have a much better success manipulating either the centers of power. And so that's, I would say, is the solution to that. I think realistically, I think you'll not get a national ban on the sale of cigarettes for probably 20 years. I think the first country to do so will be China. And I think there's a lot of movement in that direction, and I think that they'll be probably the first major country. Okay, other questions? Don't be bashful. Yeah, you're. Well, they're certainly getting a lot of attention. I remember that's all people ever used to ask me. What about e-cigarettes? What about e-cigarettes? So someone is pushing them really, really hard. They're skyrocketing because of the promotion of them. They're certainly less deadly. It's one of these things where it depends on how they're used. If all smokers would shift over to e-cigarettes, I think that'd be fantastic. On the other hand, it's possible that they may be used as bridge products to keep people smoking the more deadly kind. So it's one of these cases where I think they could be used or abused. So I don't have a strong view on e-cigarettes. If it's kind of like whether you philosophically are okay with addiction. There is a saying going around the tobacco control community, clean nicotine, which is a little bit like clean coal or something. So, but the presumption there is that it's okay to be addicted as long as you don't get cancer, and that goes back to Michael Russell. The tar causes the cancer, the nicotine is fine. That's just the addiction. So they're definitely better, than smoking, but they're not necessarily great if depending on how you feel about addiction. Yes.
I just want to follow up on that and then have a question. One of the concerns with e-cigarettes is the unintended consequences of our secondhand smoke kind of laws and having people undermine that whole and finding actually on airplanes that people are trying to use e-cigarettes. But I've been on some flights in foreign countries now where they say cigarettes and e-cigarettes are not allowed. But I have a question with historical evidence that you've looked at. Do you see anything from the tobacco industry about shifting the topic to study of obesity? Because obesity has become such a major issue. And of course it is an important issue. But for tobacco control, a lot, as was showed in one of the slides, people think, okay, that's an old topic, everything's been taken care of. Now we need to look at this other area. Is there anything in the document
Oh, yeah.
to show that
It's full of it. Yeah, the whole idea of getting cigarettes into restaurants, and remember, cigarettes were not in restaurants. It took a campaign to get them in the 20s, and the argument was that you should reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet. And the entire campaign was an obesity campaign. And the idea was cigarettes will keep you thin, dessert will make you fat. So instead of dessert, especially women, this was one of the ways that cigarettes were made heterosocial in a social environment, was through getting women to smoke in restaurants. And the idea was that you could keep thin this way. And actually, some cigarettes were actually advertised as being trim aids or diet aids. And so, yeah, there's been a long history of playing on obesity. In fact, I've even seen the argument that the obesity epidemic is caused by a decline in smoking. And, so the industry has been playing off this for over a century now. Yeah. That's very good. And your point about denormalization is very important, too, that electronic cigarettes, if they make it ordinary to smoke and they look at just like, and you have to ask in a restaurant, oh, is that electronic, is that not, that creates a problem. Yes?
So would a concentrated campaign to talk about cigarettes or ugly cigarettes make you ugly be effective?
I think so, yeah. The idea of cigarettes making you ugly is an incredibly important one. I got a call from a balding company, a company worried about balding, and there's evidence that smoking causes balding, and they were very interested in using this fact in their sort of fields to, you know, people are not worried about their lungs, they're worried about their noses, their mouth, and that's why the teeth ads are so effective. If you ask like people in Brazil what packs are the most effective warnings, they'll say it's the ones that show bad teeth. Those are the only ones that smokers will actually return and say, no, give me the one with the lungs. and then those ones with the teeth have to be returned to the factory and then have to be produced again as teeth ones again. So in other words, one really needs to, we were talking about this earlier, one really needs to do focus groups to find the maximally effective messaging. And it's not obvious. It may be the teeth, it may be the nose, it may be the bad complexion. So aging, I think, is an important one. There are lots of things that can, we haven't thought enough creatively about the type of messages that are most effective. Radioactivity is another one. A lot of people don't like the fact there's radioactivity in smoke, and that can be used more. So yeah, sexual dysfunction is another one that seems to work. So there's a lot of, by the way, we have a website on this. It's called Srita at Stanford. We have 10,000 high-quality downloadable images of anti-tobacco ads and all of the best tobacco ads that are downloadable for PowerPoint. So if you look at Stanford research, it's also called Not a Cough in a Carload. And they're very high-quality images, and you can download them, and they're very easy. And we have a lot of these sort of images on there. Yeah?
What are your thoughts on banning the display of tobacco products or cigarettes? If you ever seen it, you will have.
Say it again louder, please.
What's your opinion on banning of product display?
Oh, yeah.
Tobacco product display that the industry is trying to bring in?
Yes, well, of course, it's a great thing. Yeah, ban the display. Why should the display be legal of those products? There's a long history of them using end caps and other types of displays, power walls, of creating this visual thing which is easily shoplifted, which promotes consumption, which is impulse display. They're put right with the candy. There's a whole psychology to the placement of these ads in stores, and they've thought very carefully about the size and the positioning and the covering of the warning and this and that. And so, yeah, the displays, the pack is the last bastion one of the last bastions of advertising that's visible to everyone. Almost all advertising is directly to the smoker, and so that's why it's invisible to all of us here. The industry spends $500 per smoker advertising directly to their home. But for the non-smokers, the pack itself, which is a form of micro ad, is the last bastion of sort of public messaging they're able to get across. So that should be, there's still massive tobacco advertising in our country, $12 billion spent a year on advertising and promotion. And yeah, advertising is one obvious one of these displays. Yeah, Joanna.
So you've argued sort of eloquently and forcefully, what a bad product this is. So it's harmful to the environment, it's deadly, it's defective, financial burden. And I guess, so clearly, I think you argue that the reason that we haven't done anything serious about this completely preventable public health tragedy is the tobacco industry itself. But I guess I want to ask you as a historian, so seeing really the big picture, are there other factors, do you think?
Of course, there's many other. Yeah, this goes back to corruption. The media is to blame. The founder of Ms. Magazine used to say it was a tragedy that she had to include all of these tobacco ads in Ms. Magazine, which really kept Ms. Magazine afloat for decades. Sports, they were the major funder of sports. Sports became a vehicle for cigarettes, and that went both ways. The sports people are helping it. Filmmakers, Hollywood is massively in bed with the tobacco industry. They need to switch sides. Every part of society has been contaminated by this industry, and therefore is partly to blame. Academics for ignoring this issue and for collaborating with them. There are only 3 historians have testified against the tobacco industry, And at least 80 and probably over 100 have worked with the tobacco industry. So the scale of resources in the academy is way out of whack. So professors are guilty of this. You know, there's plenty of guilt to go around, I think, and complicity. And the industry has been successful in capturing these, but these other groups have allowed themselves to be captured. So I think it really is a polycausal epidemic. That's for sure. It could go on and on about that forever. Taxation, I call it the second addiction. You know, England in 1950, 20% of their entire revenue was just from tobacco taxes. The entire Nazi state, 10% of the Nazi state was just tobacco taxes. The entire SA, the brown shirts, 2/3 of all of their income just from their own brand of cigarettes. You know, so so you can make a lot of guilt go a lot of spread around.
I think we're at our time.
Oh, is there one more question here? Okay, yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you're the first person I've heard say abolish cigarettes. And I was surprised at that, but then you also said that we locally have the power to ban cigarette
Yes.
overnight. Now,
Ban the sale of cigarettes.
ban the sale of cigarette overnight. Now, how could I, or anyone here, have the resources, or do you know of what type of resources that we can access to find out more information?
Well, I think the key would be to try to find a community willing to do this. There are probably lots of communities that don't smoke at all, small communities, and have them enact a ban on the sale of cigarettes, which might have no influence whatsoever on the rate of cigarette smoking in that town, but it would set a real interesting model. You know, there are dry counties still today left over from Prohibition where there's no sale of alcohol. You could have a dry, a county from the point of view of cigarette sales. So I think the opportunity is someone needs to just go out and find a community willing to do this, and realizing that, it would probably be good publicity for that whatever community. So that's what I would do.
Well, this is so important. As you sort of said, we've got a tragedy on our hands, and it really is refreshing to hear from someone so knowledgeable and scholarly who's going to take us seriously and propose radical solutions to tremendous problems. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. And you heard it here first, China the first country to ban sale cigarettes. My bet is with you.
Okay, thank you.